unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan Vaishnav. India's celebrated education technology company Byjus went from being one of the world's most hyped startups to being sued for fraud in a Delaware court and accused of engaging in unethical, if not illegal, behavior. The episode serves as a cautionary tale about the world of startups, venture capital, and the social pressures Indian children and parents face on a daily basis. The story of the rise and sudden fall of Baijus and its founder, Byju Raveendran, is meticulously detailed by the journalist Yudhijit Bhattacharjee in a new piece for the online magazine Rest of World titled The Math Tutor and the Missing $533 Million. Bhattacharjee is a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine, and his writing has appeared in The New Yorker, National Geographic, Wired, and other U.S. magazines. He's also the author of the New York Times best-selling nonfiction thriller, The Spy Who Couldn't Spell, and host of the 8-episode podcast, Scam Likely. To talk more about his recent reporting, I'm pleased to welcome Yudhijit to the podcast for the very first time. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks so much, Milan, for having me on.
So I want to start with a little bit of background for some of our listeners. Tell us a bit about who Byju Raveendran is and how did he get this inspiration for this ed tech company, Byjus?
So Byju Raveendran is a really interesting entrepreneur, technologist, educator, who rose from humble beginnings and achieved sort of superstardom over a very short period of time, and then since then has sort of crashed and burned. Byju Raveendran was an exceptionally gifted math tutor who was very good at math, not just in doing it himself, but also in teaching it. And so many years ago, back in the early 2000s, he started to teach math to groups of his friends and their friends. And then he got the idea of sort of scaling up this operation, going online with instructional videos, which led to the founding of this company that he called Byjus back in 2015. Byjus was an online learning app for math and for other subjects that quickly gained in popularity. And suddenly you had venture capitalists from all over the world making a beeline to invest in this company. So it grew and grew and grew very rapidly until some bad things started to happen.
You know, I just want to pause for a second on his story. The way that you narrate it, you know, he started to teach kind of small groups of friends, and more people, you know, started to show up for these tutoring sessions. He realized that he could charge, 1,000 rupees per ticket to cover the kind of rentals for auditoriums. He eventually is moving into sports arenas, to stadiums with, 20 or 30,000 people. I mean, this is kind of a remarkable, story of scaling up literally from nothing.
I know. I'll give you a little personal anecdote from my own life in India. I grew up in India. And I remember when I was sort of preparing for the joint entrance exam to get into one of these prestigious Indian institutes of technology, I remember going for chemistry tutoring, specifically organic chemistry, which was supposed to be something that you could do really well on to improve your rank. In the joint entrance engineering test, which is a very competitive test. It used to be competitive back then. It's even more competitive now because India's population has grown. But anyway, I remember we were a group of 13 kids who would sit around this instructor, who was a guy named Mr. Jain, who would teach. He would basically write out notes on a piece of paper that had 13 or 14 sheets underneath it with, with carbon paper in between the sheets. And we would, if person A got the first sheet of notes in the first round, then, it would rotate. So then the next time you'd get sheet number 2. So by the time you came to sheet number 13, it was really faint, but you could still read it because this guy had developed like really strong wrists. He would do this day in and day out. He was an excellent teacher. Many of us did well. But anyway, that's just an aside. But I knew from from my own experience how valued good tutors are in India, and I suppose that's what Baiju found out himself when he started his tutoring back in the early 2000s. He quickly realized that he had a gift for this, for communicating math, for simplifying problems. And so when he started getting huge numbers of students showing up to attend his classes, he realized that he could make a spectacle out of it. And that was the point of hosting these math shows at stadiums. So really, Baiju kind of projected himself as a rock star of math tutoring. And I think he was, because I've seen at least one short video of him teaching at a math stadium. See, I'm calling it a math stadium, in fact, when it's just an indoor stadium, a sports stadium with a large capacity. So I think he did a few of these events over the years. And I think he primarily did that as a marketing tool because he wanted to show just how popular he was. But yes, the stadiums were indeed packed.
I mean, your own personal anecdote and what you just said is a nice segue to kind of an important kind of environmental fact that I feel like we need to bring out, which is, there's a very well documented anxiety among many Indian families that, gaining entry to a respected college or institute of higher learning is the kind of best path to career success. And I wonder if you might just kind of say something about the sort of contextual factors operating in India, which allowed this kind of app to take off so brilliantly.
That's a great question, Millen. And you've hit the nail on the head, because that's really the crucible in which this company was born. I mean, for decades, Indian middle-class parents have pushed their kids to study hard so that they could get into a good college. And the best of those colleges in India were the IITs, the other regional engineering colleges, the state engineering colleges, the medical colleges, the management institutes. These have always been considered by middle-class India to be the gateway to a better life. And the way that you crack these tests is often by getting coached in test taking, by having the discipline to burn the midnight oil, for months on end, preparing yourself for these grueling tests. And so India's always had a pretty thriving, tutoring business. And so you've got people like Mr. Jain who used to offer their services. And then slowly you started getting the coaching centers, which were basically like little schools, conducting evening classes or morning classes for different types of tests, whether it's the engineering entrance tests or the medical entrance tests or the IAS, the civil services exam, or the management institute tests, which, the last one is what Byju himself started to specialize in. And so India had always had this, but then, once the internet penetrated deep into India, you could see that there were just, you could sort of 100x this phenomenon, because now you had people living in small towns and villages, aspiring to get a seat in these prestigious colleges, and now having the option of of taking classes online. That's why Baiju knew that he'd hit upon a great idea. He knew that there was a huge market, a huge demand for remote learning. And so if he could package his courses, his own course and courses like it online, then he knew that the app would become very popular, and it did become extremely popular.
I mean, by 2020, Byju's was situated in the kind of upper tier of global ed tech companies. I mean, you noted in the piece, by 2022, it had a valuation of $22 billion. I mean, it's a stunning number, right? And I'm wondering, you mentioned he figured out how to package it, how to market it. How did Byju's attract a kind of who's who of venture capital and institutional investors?
Well, success begets success, and I think that Byju's was a master at attracting investors, because people from the outside just saw future growth. They just had dollar signs in their eyes, because they knew that India's population being what it is, that there'd be just hundreds of millions of students wanting to subscribe to this app in the future. So the numbers that were true in the moment were simply, for investors, foreshadowing huge success and growth in the future. And I have somebody in the story, a former executive that worked for one of Byju's companies, say that, a lot of investors think that everything in India can just be multiplied by 1.4 billion people. And so every business, especially businesses or especially venture capitalists who don't have any idea about how India really works, when they come into India, they think, wow, so many people. Well, of course, there's going to be tremendous growth and profitability. It's a no-brainer. Let's put the money in. And so if A puts the money in, then B thinks, well, A just put the money in, so I need to put the money in too. I mean, that's how the valuation got to this insane level, which ultimately everyone could see was not justified by the profits that the company was actually making.
I mean, you write that in the absence of real profits, Byju's became dependent on new rounds of fundraising. Each round was enabled by massive spending on brand building. They spent millions of dollars on endorsements. At one point, I think you say they became an official sponsor of the FIFA World Cup. I mean, tell us a little bit about their marketing efforts. I mean, what was the kind of strategy that they employed to kind of to do this brand building?
Well, their strategy was to create a lot of flash and blitz. I heard from one of Byju's former employees that even in the early days of Byju's, back in 2015, when he was just starting to build the brand, he had just launched the app, he would spend an outsized amount on buying advertising, full page ads in the Times of India, for instance, which cost a lot of money. And so people would advise him. They'd say, hey, are you sure you want to spend that much? And he'd say, absolutely. And he would just take that risk. And so the brand just kept growing. In 2017, he brought in, Shah Rukh Khan to do an ad for him, which attracted a lot of attention because Shah Rukh Khan is Shah Rukh Khan. And then he became a sponsor. Byju's became a sponsor to the Indian cricket team, which is another huge expenditure. So more than actual success itself on the ground, Byju knew that projecting success was more important than real success. Now, he's not the first one to have discovered this. This is this is this is the story of so many startups and businesses that if you dress like you're a billionaire, then one day the billions will follow. It's kind of that theory. And so even though Baiju started out with a very good product to begin with, a lot of people have praised the product itself. I think he quickly realized that simply relying on the product wasn't enough, that he needed to uh, create an aura around the company, and he successfully did that.
By 2018 or so, you say that some of the cracks in Byju's began to appear. And, as you mentioned, venture capital, other funders have this idea of, you do something in India, you multiply by 4 billion. So there's this constant pressure to acquire new subscribers. You write in some detail about the strategies Byju's employed, which, essentially were pretty questionable, ethically, right, in terms of signing up new subscribers. Tell us a little bit about how that actually worked on the ground.
Well, Byju, of course, knew that you can't multiply everything by 1.4 billion, and that you can hit your cap on growth pretty quickly if you just go by the middle class, because the middle class is just a small segment of the Indian population. But he couldn't afford to stop there. He needed to show that there were new subscribers, that there would be new subscribers still. And so there was tremendous pressure on the marketing team at Byju's to go out and get new subscribers from segments of the population that really couldn't afford the app. I mean, these are families that get by on very little income. Vegetable vendors, fruit sellers, auto rickshaw drivers. I mean, this is most of the Indian population, and of course, many of them have done slowly better and better over the years. They are moving up the socioeconomic ladder, but they have a long way to go before they can start affording, high quality education for their kids, because public education in India, as in many other parts of the world, is not the best. And so if you want to be competitive, if you want to take one of these competitive exams and succeed, then you do need tutoring, you need special instruction. And so many of these families had the aspiration, but they didn't have the means. And this is the segment that the marketing team increasingly went after, using all sorts of hard sell tactics. I heard, for example, stories about how they would go and they'd just do sort of they'd test the family's kid. They'd give them sort of, difficult problems to solve. And when they couldn't solve them, they'd be like, well, your kid really needs help. And so immediately parents would be worried that, their kid was falling behind. I mean, these were just manipulative tactics to get these parents to sign on. When parents said, look, we can't afford it, Byju's came up with a solution. They tied up with banks, and they arranged for loans to be given to these families so that they could subscribe. And often, within maybe 2 months, 3 months, the family would start defaulting on the loan. But by then, Byju's would have moved on. And so quietly that subscription would be lost, but somehow there'd still be this, this inflated number, and this ability to show growth on the books in the number of subscribers, even though that growth wasn't attached to any revenue.
2020 comes around, this kind of world-changing COVID-19 pandemic hits. shut down schools in India, particularly for quite a long time, gave a boost around the world really to virtual learning. Now, this would seem like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for an ed tech company like Byju's. How did it fare during the pandemic?
So during the pandemic, Byju's sensed an opportunity not because of what was going on with virtual learning, but more so because what investors thought was going on with virtual learning. So investors thought, oh my God, this is just going to take off now. And so investments just compounded. And once that happened, Byju's knew that they had to do something to show growth. And one way of showing growth was to acquire companies. And so they went on this acquisition spree starting sometime in 2017, 2018. They acquired Akash, which was a very successful coaching center business, like a physical business with centers all over the country. Um, they acquired companies in America, including Epic, which is a very popular, learning company here in the U.S. Osmo, White Hat Junior, which is a company that teaches coding, software coding to kids. And it appears that there was no real vision behind these acquisitions. The idea was simply that there was money coming in and that money had to be allocated in order to justify, or rather to show that the company was growing, that the Baiju empire was growing.
Hey, Grant the Masha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant the Masha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. In 2022, Byju's announced it received new funding from a global tech fund called Sumeru. You and others had some questions about this fund. What did you learn when you started digging into this particular investment?
Right. Well, I should say that it wasn't me that started digging. It was actually a very diligent and talented journalist in India named Pradeep Saha of the publication The Morning Context, who started digging. Much of the Indian press had simply run the story as, Byju wins big again. Here's more funding coming in for Byju's. But Pradeep Saha got a tip that this money actually never came in. And so when he started digging, he discovered that this was essentially a phantom investment, that it didn't exist. It was and then he discovered that even though Byju's knew that this money hadn't come in, they were still, telling the market that they had received this investment. And so it appeared, you'll really have to connect the dots, but it appeared that this kind of investment had almost been ginned up, that this was just nothing but an announcement of an investment that had been ginned up in order to inflate Byju's valuation ultimately, because, with every round of investment, the valuation goes up. And when Pradeep Saha looked in further, he saw that this wasn't the first such investment, that there'd been a prior investment very much like this that had never come in. What was interesting about Sumeru was, and Pradeep's reporting on this is quite detailed. He lays it out in his book, The Learning Trap, which anybody interested in the Byju story should definitely go out and buy this book. Sumeru was interesting because it had made many such investments that were all just nothing but, um, you know, but announcements or promises of investment that never came through. So it would appear that this was kind of a well thought out plan to inflate Baiju's valuation, at least in that round.
So I want to ask you about another mysterious transaction. Byju's was taken to court in Delaware for alleged fraud. It was said that the firm transferred more than $500 million to a somewhat enigmatic hedge fund called Camshaft. And when lenders who had lent Byju's funds did some digging, they discovered that this was a rather strange outfit. In fact, you point out that the business address for this fund had once been listed as being inside an IHOP, an International House of Pancakes, in Miami, which is, kind of a remarkable thing. Tell us a little bit about this relationship Byju's had with this supposed hedge fund.
Well, so let me back up just a little bit. Like you said, Byju's took this $1.2 billion loan from American lenders in 2022. And then, the company needed money at that point because it had paid all this money to acquire these companies that I told you about, White Hat Junior, Akash, and so on. And as would come out later, the company's core business wasn't making a profit. In fact, it was making a loss. So there was probably a big cash crunch of the company, and that's why Byju needed this term loan. And a few months later, perhaps a year later, after Byju started to default on the loan repayment, the lenders started some legal action to try and recover the loan. And that's when they made this discovery that $533 million of this $1.2 billion had vanished. They couldn't find it. And so they kept digging and finally discovered that the $533 million had been sent to a hedge fund called Camshaft, which, like you said, seemed like a very dubious operation, because a company that handles hundreds of millions of dollars shouldn't have its office listed as residing inside of an IHOP. And the company was run by a guy named William Morton, who hadn't even finished high school, leave alone college. He just didn't seem to have the right background to be running such a large, financial operation. And so it started to look like Byju had simply diverted this money out of the loan without letting the lenders know, because he wanted the money for something else.
I mean, I guess that's the question, right, Yudhijit? I mean, to what end, right? I mean, have you been able to sort of pinpoint why he undertook this transaction? I mean, he is quite defensive in the piece, is saying, look, I mean, this was just, he was advised to go with this hedge fund. There was nothing untoward about it. Have you been able to kind of figure out what the objective of this was?
I have not. I mean, in the absence of any other explanation, it would appear that this was just money taken out of, out of the account simply for either for personal gain or to settle debts or to somehow, to invest in sort of some secret ventures. But, I hesitate to use the word stealing, but, if you speak to the lawyers of the American lenders, then that is the word that will spring to their tongue. That essentially it appears that 533 million was just stolen from this term loan.
I mean, you went to see Byju in Dubai, and, he's somebody who had accumulated a lot of money in a short period of time. He had appeared on the Forbes list of richest Indians. He was known to kind of have, a kind of lavish lifestyle. He, I think, showed up in a Cadillac. Although what he showed you was something different, right? I mean, he took you for kind of a very simple South Indian meal of idli sambar and, was, I think, dressed in just kind of a plain T-shirt. What did you make of him when you spent more than 5 hours with him?
Yeah, so I was surprised. I mean, I really did. I didn't think he was lying to me when he was saying that he was down to earth. I mean, he does seem pretty down to earth, and I think that is genuine. But it's only half the story. He also is the owner, or has been the owner, of just tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. I learned about all the properties that he had owned in Bangalore. I learned about all the cars that he had owned there. When he came to pick me up from the hotel, he did show up in a Cadillac, which was very impressive. I mean, certainly for me, because I drive a Prius, and so I had, I got enough information from people that had worked for him that made it clear that this was only, like, he was being very selective in sort of disclosing, his financial status and how accustomed he'd gotten to wealth. Not just him, but also his wife and co-founder of Baijus, Divya Gokulnath. So it's clear. I'd heard from another source that he lived in sort of this really mansion of a house in Dubai. That he wasn't hurting. That he was living a life of luxury. He'd been living in luxury for years, even though personally his own style is still fairly down to earth. But I could be down to earth, and still sort of own an island, and then I could wear flip-flops on the island, and I'd go I'd forsake chairs and couches and just sit on the floor, on my large estate. Like that, I mean, so those two things can
Right.
coexist. And I feel like that's probably the reality for Byju.
I mean, tell us a little bit about where things stand now with the company. I mean, it seems like in your interactions, he still holds out hope for regaining control of his company. And if not successful in that endeavor, that he would like to get back out, start a new company. I mean, he said that, he could go out and teach and, attract tens of thousands of people. So, where do things stand today?
Well, I think his legal troubles have only been mounting. The Delaware court earlier this year, it issued a judgment saying that, yes, but the 533 million had indeed been illegally transferred. Now there's a new lawsuit that specifically says that from the lenders accusing Byju of having stolen the money, of having engineered this conspiracy along with others of stealing the money. So I think that Byju will be quite busy for a while trying to defend himself against these charges. But look, the man clearly had a lot of charm at one point, and I don't think that the charm has deserted him. I mean, I quite sort of liked his company the few hours that I spent with him. I knew that, that he was being selective with the truth. I could tell that he was he was obfuscating some details, and I could tell that, I would ask him questions, and he would say, "Yes, I'll send you this document. I'll send you these names," and then he'd never send them to me. And that's a classic technique that that people who are being less than honest often use. They'll promise things to your face, and then they'll never follow up. So from all of those signs, I knew that he was being economical with the truth. But he's still charming. He can still be persuasive. He can still convince people that he might be able to deliver. And look, as you can see, there are investors out there looking to plow their money into something that they think will bring them quick profits. And if he's able to persuade them that, hey, this is a new Byju's 2.0, this is going to be a 3.0, we'll have this other platform, and, we'll simply focus on tutoring or something like that. I mean, he could change his narrative based on, or he could change his pitch based on the new circumstances, and perhaps he would succeed. But I don't think that these lawsuits are going away anytime soon. Only in the last 2 or 3 weeks, I just read news that a couple of the American companies of the Baijus empire that he had acquired a few years ago were recently sold at throwaway prices by the lenders, because the lenders are trying to recoup their loan. So if that trend continues, then I don't know how many resources he'll have left. And plus, he'll be liable, so I don't think we've seen the end of the story. My personal feeling is that he started out with very good intentions, but, suddenly, he couldn't believe it. He couldn't believe that he was seeing not tens, but hundreds of millions of dollars flowing in. And I think that may have destabilized him. It may have, really derailed him from his absolutely original mission of just teaching math to kids and enjoying it. I do think that there's a core of truth to that. So I wouldn't just, be completely negative about the man's beginnings. But I don't think there's any doubt that in the last several years, many of the practices that the company engaged in were either unethical or outright fraudulent, according to the court. This is, I haven't been able to do a full in-depth analysis of their business practices. I'm not competent to do that, but the court certainly has ruled decisively against him in the matter of the missing $533 million.
I mean, I want to ask you by way of closing, what do you think the larger lessons are from this debacle? I was reading an editorial published in the Financial Times about the Baijus fiasco, and I just want to quote a selection from that editorial. It says, venture capitalists are by nature exuberant. As a result, they can sometimes stuff exciting companies with excess capital and press them to expand too quickly until the entire operation chokes, leading them to jump ship. I'm wondering whether you sense in this particular case any meaningful reflection or learning when you speak to the various actors who are kind of implicated in this episode, and that includes the investors who doubled down and kept doubling down.
Well, I came away with the feeling that some of the investors knew what was going on, but they had no incentive to stop the juggernaut from rolling on, the juggernaut of inflated figures and and false promises or exaggerations. Because they stood to benefit from it. They wanted the valuation to keep rising. And so they were not going to go and clear the air, or they were not going to pull Baiju aside and say, hey, we really need to see your profit and loss statement. We need to see, nobody wanted to kick the tires because in some corner of their mind, they knew that if they kicked too hard, the whole car might crumble, you know? So, so I think the lesson here is that, there's a lesson for startups and there's a lesson for investors. And then there's a lesson for the media. There's a lesson for consumers of any type of technology. And there's a lesson for, stockholders. I mean, if the company were to go public. But I think startups need to, again, I'm not a startup consultant, but it seems that if Byju had stuck to just the math app, if he had decided that he wouldn't acquire any new companies, if he had decided that he would just focus on his core competence, his own core competence, and that of his founding team, then perhaps he would have been, quite successful, but maybe he wouldn't have ever been a $22 billion company. He might have been a $2 billion company, but he might still be around as a $2 billion company. I think that's one lesson. For investors, the lesson is to really, to do due diligence. I mean, it's the same lesson for journalists. I come across information all the time or story ideas all the time that seem too good to be true, that I don't, that I would love to just run with. But I have to wait, and then I have to go back to all the sources. I have to look at it from all angles and be like, could this really be true? Where's the evidence? And it doesn't make any sense. And be the devil's advocate. I mean, we know now in this, we're living in an age of self-deception, where hype kind of becomes reality like within hours or days. And so doesn't matter how many people think that something is true, that by itself doesn't make it true. Just the fact that several investors believed that Byju's would succeed didn't mean that Byju's was fundamentally strong as a company, as a business. So a new investor would have done well to say, look, I don't know what you guys are seeing. I need to see it first before I put in money. I mean, I'm not saying anything that is radically new here. I'm just, we just keep learning these. I think we as in society as a whole keeps learning these lessons afresh with every disaster, with, with Elizabeth Holmes, with, with Sam Altman, with, and now with Byju's. They're all different cases. I'm not saying they're identical and that they're all thieves and they're all frauds. I don't know. I mean, I think the story is complicated and different for every single one. But the overarching lesson is the same, which is try to cut through the hype. There are investors who will very smartly try and find out, well, what does the company really need? What is the direction in which they need to expand, and what resources will that require? And let's put in those resources and not more than that. Let's also evaluate, assess before putting in yet more money, before releasing more funding. I don't know. I'm sure that people have been saying this type of thing for decades, and and yet investors have still been falling in the traps knowingly because they can benefit, because they think that if the valuation keeps rising, they can just sell and exit, and it doesn't matter, that they knew all along that there was no real business, no real profit underneath. If they believed that the hype would carry them through, well, somebody's going to be left holding the bag, and I think that's what happened.
And I should just point out as a final note that many of the investors who did invest did make out pretty well because they exited at the right time.
Exactly. And, and I suppose somebody needs to investigate. It's also, one thing that I found strange about this story when I was reporting it is how reluctant everyone was to talk about what went on. I mean, I've never had this kind of experience reporting a story. I've reported tons of stories, involving difficult subjects, involving crimes and corruption
Espionage.
And so on. Exactly. And I've never had this experience where, everyone just shuts down and says, I'm sorry, I can't talk to you. I won't tell you anything. Don't use my name. Even if I talk to you, I'll just, talk to you for half an hour. I mean, it was just really ridiculous. And I feel that there's a lot more to the story that we have not unearthed at all. I mean, what I've done here is, I hope a good, entertaining job and illuminating job, but I think it only scratches the surface. I think Pradeep Saha has done a pretty good job, but I think that there's a lot more to be found about what investors knew what when, and why they made the decisions that they did to stay in when they stayed in, to invest when they did, and to exit when they did, because it's impossible that none of them had any clue about what was really going on.
My guest on the show this week is the journalist Yudhijit Bhattacharjee. He's the author of a new piece for the online magazine Rest of World titled The Math Tutor and the Missing $533 Million. He's also a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine, and his writing has appeared in esteemed places like the New Yorker, National Geographic, Wired, and elsewhere. Yudhijit, it was really a fascinating story. Congrats on the piece, and thanks again for taking the time.
Thank you so much, Milan. I love talking to you.
Grantamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show, to support the work we do on Grantamasha, and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, grantamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer. Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Additional assistance is provided by Annabelle Richter. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.